Welcome everyone to today's session of the Alum Fellows Reading Series at the Hutchins Center here at Harvard. We are fortunate to have Sinclair Bell presenting his work and Ulrike Roth serving as the discussant. After their discussion, we will open up the session to the audience for Q&A. I am delighted to welcome back Alum Fellow Sinclair Bell. He's Professor of Art History and Presidential Teaching Professor at Northern Illinois University, where he teaches Greek, Etruscan, and Roman art and architecture. Dr. Bell has excavated at sites in Italy and Tunisia and worked as a curatorial assistant at museums in Germany and Greece. He studied classical art and archaeology at the Universities of Oxford, Edinburgh, and Cologne, receiving his PhD in classics at Edinburgh. In addition to having held the Richard D. Cohen Fellowship with us here at the Hutchins Center, he is the recipient of numerous prestigious grants and awards in support and recognition of his scholarship and teaching. These include an NEH Fellowship, the Howard Fellowship from the Howard Foundation at Brown University, and the Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome. Most recently, Dr. Bell is the 2024 recipient of the Archaeological Institute of America's Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching Award. This award is given annually to those who have demonstrated excellence in the teaching of archaeology, developed innovative teaching methods or interdisciplinary curricula, and demonstrated attention to issues of diversity and inclusion among their students and the curriculum. His research is broadly concerned with Etruscan and Roman material culture and art, with special interest in sport and spectacle and freed slaves and foreigners. His publications encompass 18 co-edited volumes, including the 2024 book, Brill's Companion to the Reception of Vitruvius, co-edited with Ingrid Rowland. Also coming out next year is Freed Persons in the Roman World, as well as Spectators in the Roman World. Sinclair Bell's monograph on the social and cultural significance of the Roman chariot races is also forthcoming. I think that may be the Spectators in the Roman World. Ethiopians in Roman art and society, visualizing difference in a multi-ethnic empire, is his current book-length project, and we look forward to hearing about that today. The very distinguished Ulrike Roth serves as reader in ancient history in the School of History, Classics, and Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. At the starting point of her current career, and she has had a couple of others, including running her own restaurant, she completed her doctorate in ancient history at the University of Nottingham with work that focused on the role of enslaved women in Roman agriculture. She continues to specialize in the study of Roman slavery in the ancient and early medieval worlds. Besides her recent research on child slavery in Rome, supported by the Leverhulme Trust Major Research Fellowship, her work carries several broad concerns, such as the nature of slave exploitation in different societies, how slavery and freedom were conceptualized in antiquity, and how ancient slavery is related to later slaveries, as well as their legacies on the modern world. Dr. Roth also explores non-Roman peoples of ancient Italy, which is connected to the broader question of how to write history from a muted past, which in turn has driven her scholarship on Roman slavery. She is the author of a prodigious number of important publications, including Thinking Tools, Agricultural Slavery Between Evidence and Models. Forthcoming from Cambridge University Press is Saving Libertas, Livy, the Gallic Sack of Rome, and the Shape of Roman History. And she is currently completing the manuscript, The Curse of Thistle and Thorn, Child Slavery in the Roman Empire. Dr. Roth is the founding series editor of the Edinburgh Studies in Ancient Slavery. Welcome to you both, and Dr. Bell, would you like to begin?
Thank you so much, Krishna. Okay, so I'm going to temporarily disappear and will reappear in 20 minutes. So I just want to foreground what it is I'm talking about specifically today, because I'm going to take a kind of long route to get there by giving some background information. So this is the kind of material that forms the focus of my discussion. So we begin with the question of how could we recognize a sexually enslaved person in classical antiquity, such as a pet slave, as they were known in the Roman world. The famed archaeologist and art dealer, Rodolfo Lanciani, was pretty sure he knew. On May 20th, 1888, Lanciani composed a handwritten account of ancient Roman works that he was preparing for sale to the United States. Among the works in his Group 8, Roman and Greek busts, was the head of a young man, which he ultimately sold for 120 lira to the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And that's where it remains on display today, actually at the entranceway to their Roman portraiture galleries. Lanciani described the sculpture as follows. Portrait head of an African, pet slave, question mark, representing most carefully the characteristics of the Negro race. Woolly hair, big lips, flat eyes, prominently flat nose, etc. In another letter, written a short while later, he enumerated the unique value of this head based on that same identification. Quote, I hope you will gladly accept this otherwise strange head of a Negro. Portraits of pet slaves or freedmen from North Africa are very scarce. I only know two. By letting the Negro population of New England know that the portrait bust of one of their ancestors, some 2,000 years old, has just arrived from Italy, my lord, what crowds will assemble in the museum, end quote. Now, as problematic as such passages now strike us, and they should, they constitute crucial records for reconstructing how a renowned archaeologist marketed ancient objects to his prominent American buyers at the turn of the 19th century. And these are just a couple of views of the head before it was reinstalled in Boston maybe 2 years ago. In addition, or even more importantly, passages such as these invite us to interrogate the presuppositions of their author. How could one confidently identify an image of a Roman pet slave in the first place? And why would such a person be necessarily interchangeable with a freedman as he is held to be here? For Lanciani, these identifications were clearly based upon their young subjects' alleged African ethnicity. By contrast, the recently updated catalog entry for this head on the Museum of Fine Arts website cautiously and wisely argues the opposite of Lanciani's views and argues against some of the former curatorial staff at the museum as well. As that new curatorial entry states, nothing can be securely asserted about either the subject's social status or his ethnic origins without nomenclature from an inscription, preserved patination, dress, and or a documented fine context. And lastly, but far from least, lost in Lanciani's passages above are any consideration of the personhood of the subject so skillfully visualized by the sculptor. Instead, he is just an, quote, otherwise strange person whose phenotype appeared to map onto ancient ethnic and sexual categories that worked to Lanciani's favor. That is, the scarcer the person, the more profitable their representation would be for him. As this example illustrates, the intersection of slavery, sexuality, and ethnicity can be a minefield for scholars of classical antiquity. And yet the writings of Lanciani come from what is at best scholarly marginalia, notes, entirely fitting given that pet slaves are a category of person that has long been relegated to the margins of the field itself. For even though there are art historical studies which seek to identify such individuals in Roman art, there are no comprehensive investigations of the sexual lives of the enslaved, especially children and youth, despite all of the interest in both slavery and sexuality in Greece and Rome more broadly. However, there are a number of important recent and forthcoming interventions that are set to change that. One is Deborah Kamen and Toph Marshall's 2021 volume on sexuality and slavery in classical antiquity, with chapters devoted to ancient material culture. Another is Sarah Beckman's recent article in the American Journal of Archaeology, which deals with a painted image of a nude boy from Pompeii and searches out its wider significance. And most directly related, a forthcoming volume, Enslaved Childhoods in the Roman Imperial World, Alienation, Accommodation, Approbation, edited by Ulrike Roth. I hope then that my own project will eventually add to those interventions. So today I'll briefly discuss my ongoing project, which concerns the representations of Ethiopians in Roman art. In particular, I'm going to discuss one offshoot of that work. It's a corpus of works that represent Ethiopian boys in sculpture, both bronze and stone. My aim is to outline the intellectual influences that run through the project, to discuss the nature of the evidence, as well as its evidentiary and interpretive challenges, and finally to suggest some ways in which we might make these works speak to issues that transcend the Roman Empire alone. In a nutshell, these issues concern visual expressions of male beauty, especially through nudity, and especially of children, concepts of ethnicity, and how enslavement and empire bind them all together. As this talk is intended for a broad audience, and as my research is still developing, I'll be talking through the images rather than presenting a discrete set of conclusions. I welcome feedback, and I particularly look forward to discussing these issues with Ulrike Roth, whom I'm grateful to for sharing her time and expertise today. I also want to acknowledge the assistance of the staff at the Hutchins Center, especially Krishna Lewis, for the invitation to speak in the Alumni series, and to Tom and Justin for helping to realize it through their mastery of the technical details. And finally, my thanks to all of you, the invisible audience, for joining me on this brief and oftentimes disturbing trip into antiquity. So the first thing in talking about this work is to place one of the primary influences, and that is the representation, literary, visual, of Blacks, or what I prefer to refer to as Ethiopians, in ancient Roman society. There has been the foundational work of Snowden and Thompson, and then this has been followed up kind of indirectly by the work of Isaac and Grew. And Isaac, because he doesn't actually deal with Ethiopians at all, and Gruen because they're sort of marginal to his larger discussion. But it is to say that there is a renewed interest of late in these kinds of representations. There's a new book that concerns the representation of Blackness in Greek art and literature, primarily literature. And there is a book, a dissertation book, forthcoming on the representation of Black Africans in Etruscan art. So there's a lot of exciting work. My own work has been developed first as a chapter that I wrote at the Hutchins Center and published in the volume on the left. And this very much follows, relies upon and follows within the tradition of the image of the Black in Western art, which is a series that originates at Harvard. And so I'm immensely grateful for the time at the Hutchins Center, which allowed me to really distill these ideas, to be challenged in my thinking, and to step outside of classical antiquity and to look more broadly at these issues. So very briefly, just 3 points about what we're talking about. As some of you may know, there are 3 types of representations of Africans, or the idea of Africa. The first are representations which look at distinct persons. We might call them ethnographic to a certain extent, even though they clearly don't have that value, but they're looking at the physiognomic traits and hair, for example, in order to try to understand or to capture these people that they either observed directly or just imagined. We have these in many different media. There is something very distinct that the Romans do that the Greeks and Etruscans don't, which is that they create life-size representations, and I'll get back to that in a moment. So but we're not always sure if these images are realistic or they're caricature or they are someplace in between. The second type is the African continent or African places. We know, for example, pygmy representations from Pompeii. And this is not something I'm interested in because it's been very well discussed already. And then thirdly, again, a topic that has been studied comprehensively, which is the idea of Africa through abstraction and personification. And so in other words, the idea of Africa as a place or a person. Now, the literary sources aren't particularly helpful in allowing us to understand who the Ethiopians might have been. We have very few discussions about them in Latin literature, and they're not particularly useful. They are, they need to be considered, but they're not particularly insightful. But they go to the larger point, like the representations in art, that in the geographical imagination, Africa is an area of confusion and disorientation. So we know that the Romans are representing the other, and we're not always sure that the Romans know what they're representing. They're representing difference, but to what end? And so with Versluis, this goes to the larger argument that Rome used the other, the cultures and styles of the people it conquered for its own identity formation. So Ethiopians, in this sense, need to be understood as part of this larger imperial project, this impulse to sort of capture visually the other. So in addition to this first theme of looking at Ethiopians in Roman art, there is the second theme, and this is where I'm expecting to make the greatest contribution with these works. And that's the intersection of male youth and beauty, of ethnicity and enslavement. So on the one hand, this work is building on the kind of thing that's focused mostly on mythological representations, images of Dionysus, of Ganymede, and representations in Roman art that could be generally considered something like the beautiful boy, but seen through a mythological sort of lens. And so we have lots of representations of children and nude children, but there isn't a need to convey any kind of ethnicity. They're sort of generic ideal types, like this one at the Art Institute on the left. At the same time, I've been looking to the work by Roman historians and archaeologists like Lisa Fentress, who have caught attention but have not fully developed, I think, some of the really important work they've done. And so you can see on the right in her article from several years ago, in which she discussed the relationship between representation and enslavement, and how some of these images are extremely sexually suggestive, and that they are manifested all across visual media. And so her point is essentially that we need to look and acknowledge these kinds of images for what they are, that we need to see them within the context of enslavement. Now, enslavement, images of Ethiopians as enslaved, that they do show up. But what's really important is while we have a couple of these kinds of images that you see on the right, this pair from Berlin, which obviously are compatible to the kinds of things that we see on the Denarius, for example. And so here we have another example on the left in Berlin, in bronze. And so this invites us to think about the broader question of why did Romans need these kinds of images? Why would you want this kind of thing for your home? What function did it play? And certainly this appears to go to a very long-standing tradition. This unpublished statue fragment on the left, probably Hellenistic and now in Michigan, gives us evidence that this is a very old, it appears, iconography. And so this has deep roots. And there are other ways in which the concept of enslavement and ethnicity are expressed, whether it's as a kind of help servant in the image on the left from London, or this part of a flask also in London on the right. So we know that there is this tradition of representing this sort of ethnicity in this way, and a lot of important work has been done on studying these different ethnic types, the barbarian and Roman art. But what's interesting is that Ethiopians have been left out. And so in the kind of proverbial expectation that there's always going to be a German dissertation on a topic, this is one of the exceptions where there just isn't. And so if we think about these images, and so here's your kind of characteristic barbarian on the right. Sure, there are images of Ethiopians that perform a similar kind of work, but what I'm interested in talking about today is those that do something quite different. So, for example, the image on the left from the Basset Aphrodisias or the Herm, these are sort of generic types that fulfill that visual obligation of representing the other. But these are doing something different. And there is nothing comparable in terms of other ethnic groups to this. We don't see representations of Dacian boys naked who are commissioned for display in a domestic setting, like the one in the center, which is from Seuss. The image on the right, the head is actually the original image. The two don't actually go together, but the head is the important thing. And so we can imagine that there is a kind of type that goes back and has Hellenistic roots, which you can see on the left. But here in bronze, so we have stone, marble representations, but we also have bronze representations. And these are from all over the empire. On the left, from Budapest, at the center, France, and then on the right from Tarragona. And so again, I raised the question of what kind of work did these images perform that other kinds of barbarian, quote unquote, barbarian peoples couldn't? Why is it that the Romans used representations, developed this kind of artistic medium only for this ethnic group? So what is it that Ethiopians gave them that other barbarians apparently didn't? It's also important in this discussion, historiographically speaking, to acknowledge what it is we're seeing. Now, with Snowden, in his original work, which argued for this kind of notion of a racial paradise, and so that the Romans did not exhibit any kind of trace of racial prejudice, that it was a world without prejudice. He describes this figure in Tarragona as follows: statue of a youth standing with arms extended forward. And so this is a very neutral description, and these are the kinds of descriptions that show up typically with these images. But there is nothing neutral to this formulation. We all will be familiar with what a Roman citizen, even a boy that was born of slaves, what he looks like. And that is not what we're seeing on the left. And so we can't be as neutral in our descriptions as Snowden would like, because the images on the left have a very different visual language. And I, of course, acknowledge the influence and inspiration of my advisor, Glenys Davies, who's called a lot of attention to the importance of gender and body language and nudity in this sense. So body language is never neutral, and nudity is never neutral. And so we can also look to other visual media and find comparable representations, for example, in Pompeii in a domestic wall painting where we see a figure that's been identified as an Ethiopian youth. So it's clear that this is a type that ranges across visual media. Perhaps we might have other painted representations, but they don't survive. But we have them in stone, we have them in bronze, and they're doing something, a kind of work that I would suggest is that of representing a delicatus or a pet slave. But they're doing so with this added sort of charge of an ethnic aspect. And so you can have, from Pompeii, for instance, here, a boy with a dove, but understood to be a cupid, whereas here on the left, you'll note the inlays and sort of ethnic characteristics, which are communicated through the hair and also through the color of the stone. Something else that's worth thinking about here is the fact that not all of these representations are coming from the same context, by which I mean that they're all presumably made for a domestic concept. They're consumed in a home, but that's not always where we find them. And so an interesting aspect of this is that the figure from Budapest on the right is actually from a 2nd century cremation tomb, and it's also a gilded figure. So a lot of money has been invested in this figure, far more than the standard. And it's also fascinating that there's this level of investment, this level of detail and craftsmanship at a site which is essentially the armpit of the Roman Empire. And so this kind of representation tells us that based on its fine context, something else is happening here with burial context. The image on the left is from a very wealthy burial at Kent in England. And so we're finding Ethiopians in tombs. They seem to perform a distinct kind of work within the context of a tomb. And so again, we see these set up in domestic context, but it also matters to think about biography. And so this goes to Smith's larger point that the same visual form can mean quite different things in different times and places. So the detailed reconstruction of context, purpose-setting audience is essential. So while we have similarities in form, the kinds of things that Snowden talked about, he and Thompson never look into the ways in which these objects are being used in these different contexts. Where do they actually show up? One final point about this corpus just concerns the difficulty of identification. So this figure in London is identified as an African, and that's a long-standing identification. But the hair is clearly one of the principal signifiers in this identification. But not all of these representations are as sort of clear-cut in terms of their representation. Hair is the major cultural signifier in Roman art of ethnicity in this particular group. That is the feature that really stands out consistently. Skin color can't always be recognized or visualized and then recognized in different art forms. And so hair is the usual item that we use to identify them. Also, it's hard to know where some of these images fit in because they appear to align with other types. And so you have two different forms of the boy Dionysus on the right, one in Brooklyn at the center and one in Princeton on the right, far right. And so that figure in a private collection in Berlin on the left, also made out of a black, well, in this case, yeah, a black stone. But does that necessarily indicate that it originally represented an Ethiopian as it has traditionally been described? So it's not always easy to work out what belongs in the corpus and what does not. Certainly the body language and the hair of the figure on the left mark it out clearly as signifying the ethnicity of its subject. And then finally, looking at a corpus like this, we have to think about what sort of value it has within the overarching idea of imperial representation. And Wolf's point about the ideological gaze is that Romans don't generate material that allow us to look reflexively at them. They generate material which simply is prescriptive. And so to try to think of this material outside the box, I've been looking at a third intellectual tradition, which is the way in which some groups look back at empire. And the way in which, so the volume on the left, for example, has been very inspirational about different sources of evidence that give us access to alternate ways of thinking about empire, especially through visuality, or the recent exhibition and volume on the right, in which the curators have attempted to sort of unpack this notion of portraiture within the context of enslavement and slavery. And so you have, for example, the image on the left in the Vatican that I showed you a few minutes ago, and this head of an Ethiopian boy, and the striking similarities that it has between a late 19th century representation in England. So I think it's interesting to think about portraiture too, because we have numerous images that are generated of Ethiopian boys. So there's always this emphasis on youth. We have no Ethiopian girls. We have almost no Ethiopian women. why is that the Romans are almost completely generating representations of Ethiopian boys? And so on some level, it's easy to see images like that on the left within this longer tradition, and certainly that tradition, a decorative piece, which is now in Vienna on the right. They certainly take inspiration from ancient Rome. But would there be any way to use this kind of material, and for example, the so-called portraits of Ethiopian boys, to attempt to recuperate in some way the voices of the enslaved, the voices, the perspectives of those that have been visualized? And I just want to point out to those that don't know it, the wonderful example of work that's being done at the Yale University, Yale Center for British Art, in which historians have been attempting to locate the identity of the young boy who is represented in the corner. That is, you always have descriptions on the label about the founder of Yale and his associates, but this figure has been lost to history, and so historians are trying to recuperate it by going through the records of who he might be. Well, there's a wonderful contemporary art installation in which they attempted to do more than that. In fact, they attempt to foreground this boy that's always been lost in the background. And so in Titus Kaffir's Enough About You, the founder of Yale and his his companions are just left into a kind of transformed into a twisted mass, and the boy is foregrounded. And so in a sense, that's what I'm trying to think about with these images, and also in particular those quote unquote portraits of Ethiopian boys. How might we think about those images in order to give some kind of voice, at least to imagine a way of recuperating an Ethiopian perspective? Now, in the world of science, there have been attempts to use, for example, isotopic analysis. And so we've seen, for example, the ivory Bengal lady of African descent in Britain, ways in which actual historical individuals that archaeologists like Hella Eckhart have been using scientific data to try to reconstruct the life ways of someone whose descent can be traced to Africa through bones. And so I'm trying to imagine a kind of other approach in which we don't just look at these images as they've been traditionally done. And so there's also a larger movement afoot in art history, and there was an exhibition recently at the Met, I believe, in which figures like those in the background of Olympia here, in which they have again tried to work out their identity. And so this has given me sort of inspiration to think about these works. On the left is a head that's in the Art Institute in Chicago. On the right, a head recently discovered at Aphrodisias. Both clearly represent Ethiopian boys. I have a lot of difficulty in accepting either the identification of either is an actual portrait, but I think it's interesting that this very expensive visual medium is being devoted to this particular subject matter, which again is not done to our knowledge with other ethnic peoples. And so there does once more in this medium seem to be the suggestion that somehow Ethiopians are different from the rest of the different peoples that the Romans came into contact with. So we have to be very careful here. You wouldn't look at a painting by Rembrandt and think that the subjects were necessarily communicating agency. You wouldn't think that those individuals had actually commissioned that work. And so we should be careful about granting agency to a figure like that now in Chicago. But I think it does open a door to thinking more broadly about these kinds of images. We just need to be careful and be reminded of Tonio Hoscher's important caveat that ancient images are not sheer reproductions of reality, but constructions of concepts about reality. They filter and shape reality according to conceptual patterns that are valid within their societies. And so that's certainly true within a Roman context. Okay, so in summary, what I've tried to do here is outline the nature of the evidence regarding representations of Ethiopian boys as statuary. probe some of the issues of their identification and use within ancient imperial context, and think through other forms of evidence as well as representations that might help us think outside the box, where the ancient evidence is otherwise lacking. There's one thing that I hope you take away from this presentation. It's this: rather than seeing these representations as curious or odd, as otherwise strange, to return to Lanciani's phrasing, I believe that they speak in powerful but unappreciated ways about central issues of what it was like to be subaltern in Roman society. As a child, as a slave, as a foreigner, as sexually desired, and of course, potentially abused. And so, yes, these statuettes may be, quote, strange in form, perhaps, but they are also, in many ways, strikingly familiar. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Roth, would you like to engage Professor Bell in discussion?
Unmuted. Okay. Thank you, Sinclair, for an extremely rich presentation. A presentation that is also extremely troublesome. Of course, the topic is troublesome, and the past reality is troublesome. I'm going to start off our conversation by something you came to towards the end of your talk, when you talked about the agency of the people that were represented, the question about tracing their voices. One of the issues that I increasingly, as a historian myself, deal with is struggling of finding the right balance between the sense I have about my duty to excavate their views, their perspectives, their voices, their agency, and at the same time feeling, am I really having the right to do this? Am I not usurping their voices? Who am I to really understand what it was like? Which possibly, well, which is impossible, actually, if you ask me. How do you handle this tension between what we probably all think is our duty, and yet if we stop and pause, we must all realize that there are very strong limits to what we can achieve, and a lot of issues about what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, so I think I just want to, I didn't read out, I just want to read two sentences to you that I didn't get a chance to get out. And that was that I want to be clear about one point. Please don't mistake my enthusiasm for this research project, including the appreciation of the aesthetic effects of the works for Romans, with a failure to appreciate the social and psychic implications of the representations. And so what I would argue, it's a far better thing we speak openly and directly about what these representations would have meant to their original audiences, perhaps even admit them into a new kind of canon of Roman art history, rather than talk around those meanings or bury them from view entirely. And so one of the first things I'm trying to confront is just bringing them out into the open, the way in which they were sort of neutralized as images in earlier discussions, that no one was sort of talking about them really until Lisa Fentress's work, when she starts to confront the implications of this. But to your point, this project has gone in very different directions from the way I originally, conceived of it as a kind of scientific art historical study, because that ethical component has really borne down on me, that these representations have very dire suggestions, and that I don't want to just repeat the sort of Roman view. I don't want to kind of just reiterate the injustice, in a sense, of what they represent. So yeah, this has been an ongoing struggle, and that's how I got to the final section is how do we try to reconstruct that voice? I've been looking at inscriptions that talk, in which the identity of the subject is foregrounded as African, for example. There is some interesting graffiti, which is highly suggestive of, from Pompeii, of at least one, perhaps Ethiopian boy attempting to assert his agency by inscribing his name by a representation. So that is, I think, as good as it gets, probably, in terms of actual evidence. But this is the ongoing challenge, and I've realized that this is going to be that challenge is actually going to bookend my study. And so at the beginning, we'll talk about the historiography and of racism in particular in the study of Roman art and the sort of charts and problematic views. And then the end part will attempt to look back and try to tease out a voice here and there if we can from that material.
You anticipated another point I was going to bring up at one point, so I'm going to do it now. You mentioned inscriptions. You haven't yet mentioned text, as it were. Your focus is on the material evidence, the visual evidence. Can you tell us a bit more about your motivation about, shall we say, separating different bodies of evidence for what you're trying to do?
Sure. So with the studies by Thompson and Snowden, it was a clear textual focus, and this makes sense given that they were ancient historians. They use, Snowden in particular, looks to the visual evidence, the archaeological evidence, but in particular images. And this was revolutionary at the time. And his work, I don't need to tell you, fits in very nicely with Peter Burke's work, which charts the 1970s as this sort of blowout period in which historians are using ancient representations as evidence. The problem with his study in particular is his training as an ancient historian, and that means that he used images as illustrative window dressing. So, and I have found numerous flaws in his discussion of representations, and so that is not in any way to diminish what he did. It's simply to say that I found there was a need to foreground the imagery in this study as a kind of companion to Snowden. And so what that means is recognizing the complexity of images, that images have a complexity that's comparable to literary sources, that they're tendentious, they're problematic, and we have to always think about authorship and context. And so that's why I've been foregrounding them. I have not yet gotten to the part where I'm going to to tackle the literary sources and see how I can integrate them. So that may seem a little short-sighted methodologically. I've certainly looked at the sources and compiled them, but I want to foreground the ancient material culture, and it has taken a long time to go through all of those archaeological field reports, to translate the Hungarian, just to get into the details and build up a comprehensive taxonomy. And then I want to return to my roots as a philologist and get into those sources. So that's why I'm doing it this way, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I agree. I think the focus is not just for analytical purposes good, but there is a desperate need to see more of these images, because even the ones you've shown, many I have never seen before myself. There is so much out there that we don't regularly are aware of and discuss in the way that we probably regularly discuss a larger volume of the literary sources that relate to the topic. And so there's a need to make up, and looking forward to when you publish this work, when it comes to fruition, definitely. One of the points you made was that this is very unique to African or Ethiopian or whatever you want to call them. You might want to talk about why you use the word Ethiopian specifically. I was reminded of such imagery as, or bronze statuary, like the tray-bearing Santon youth, who I don't think is African. Why are you separating them out? Sort of very similar material.
Yeah, that's a great example. And in fact, in the official publication of that work, I think Charles actually draws attention to comparisons with Ethiopians. And so he sees them within a continuum. And I think that's right. Again, there's such a rich corpus that I need to just gather that corpus together. So for example, one image I didn't show you is a fairly graphic image from what is now an Italian private collection. It's a bronze youth with enlarged genitalia. So that fits in with some representations in mosaics that we know of Ethiopians, but in this case, of a boy. So this makes explicit the point that I'm talking about, which is the sexual objectification of youth. I mean, it's in bronze, and it's quite, and it's also an expensive commission. So people are Romans were throwing money at these kinds of things. They're obviously special one-offs. So I just think it's really important to gather that material together to understand it as a corpus and look at it. And then after I've done that, to draw these analogs with practices more broadly. John Polini, for example, has done excellent work on sort of what he calls sexual servants. And so there is portraits, apparently. And so, I plan to connect my work with him, but I think it's just really important to foreground how much there is here and the nature of the commissions and the dimensions and all these and the materiality of it as well. So I guess it's just, again, putting emphasis on what marks them out as different and then looking for those analogs subsequently. Because there are things that just don't happen in other types of barbarians.
Okay. Not sure if I entirely agree, but we would need to look at images together, which maybe one day we might. That would be quite good. Talk about the elephant in the room. You mentioned it, sexual abuse. If I've got myself to looking at these kinds of images, and the first thing I see is sexual abuse. The second thing maybe the tray bearing, and the third thing maybe the art or whatever. Would you think this is taking things too far? Because the burden of proof is always where does it lie? Is it a question? Do you have to show that these images arise out of the sexual abuse context? Do you have to prove it, or do you start from it? And if so, how?
Yeah, well, this is the $65,000 question. So I think that my intellectual journey began obviously with reading all of the discussions of Marshall and the literary discussions about this question about the sexual abuse of children and love for children and what does it actually mean? Are we talking about abuse, or are we just talking about affection for delicii? And what I see there is also a clear divide in the scholarship, that some Romanists, especially of an older generation, refuse to accept that sexual component. That much is clear. And so I think I would see the images in a similar way, that some people just refuse to think of the images in those terms. And, as Lisa Fentress's work points out, there is these kinds of subjective images show up in so many different contexts at so many different levels. So terracotta, it's the cheap stuff, it's the higher grade stuff, it's for domestic use, it's for funerary use. I think I don't really know how we've been able to ignore this for so long. But I think you just have to look at the literary sources and think about the way in which some of these children have been talked about, then look at the literary sources and look at how Ethiopian male servants are discussed briefly, but suggestively, and then look at the representations and ask yourself, well, what else are they doing then? Because you'd really have to explain away the nudity, the sometimes graphic genitalia. What else is it? There can be an apotropaic context for some of this, but that just doesn't work for all of it. So my question would be, how else could you understand it at this point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I can see no other way. I'm going to ask a similar question to my first one now, which is more politically loaded perhaps in today's world, and quite rightly so. You're looking at figures of colored skin, black skin, you're a white male. Do you fear that you might be not having the right to try to excavate these Black boys' agency, their voices?
I'm
asking out of my own concerns when doing this kind of work.
I think that's a completely legitimate question. My response to that would be to channel what Toni Morrison said to Bill Styron, that of course he had every right to write a book about Black experience. It might not be a very good one, but he had that right. And so I would say, let's just move it out of ethnicity, race for a second. Let's talk about, let's say, sexuality. I would never object as a gay man to having someone write the history of gays in antiquity in ancient Rome, if they didn't happen to be gay. I don't see that as a disqualifier. I certainly understand that there are components that I could be missing out on potentially. But I think the subject, I think the Roman Empire is big enough to welcome a variety of viewpoints and perspectives. I'm not claiming, the only point of view here. You write a book and it's you're staking a claim to how you see the evidence, and that's what I'll do. And that will, rise or fall based on my argumentation and my research. So I certainly understand the concerns of that idea, but as I said, from my own perspective, I don't think anyone has the right to claim exclusive, rights on that topic, on any topic.
Mhm. The absence of girls, and you said there's very few women represented. I'm not familiar with the representations of the women. You will have them in front of your inner eye. What do you make of this?
Well, if we lead with the literary sources, what's clear is that the most desired kind of servant in a Roman domestic setting is an Ethiopian because of its exoticism, its rarity. And an argument has been made, for example, with gemstones that represent the head of an Ethiopian, that, for instance, some of these representations grant the owner to possess something that they couldn't otherwise own. And so it's a kind of small scale way of giving that person possession of a type of person that they could not, physically have. And so I think that, for whatever reason, it is the boy, the youth, and never over, probably it looks like about 20, that is being desired, an Ethiopian youth. Lisa Ventures argues that, these children and youth are coming out via the Garamantes and being then transported to Rome. And it seems like that was the particular penchant. Literary sources suggested, and the visual representations don't give us really anything else to look at. We have representation on funerary relief of what appears to be an Ethiopian female servant next to a Roman matron. We've got a couple of images like that, but I have found less than 10 of Ethiopian women. And as I mentioned at one point, some of these, ethnic identifications are tricky because we're working always with qualifiers that the Latin literary sources give us. We don't have an image that has, Ethiopian written under it that we would call, like beyond the Herms, things like that. So identification is going to be tricky, but just in terms of the representation of gender, it's 99% men, boys.
You said the material is found both at the high end of art and the very basic art. Don't know if you should call it popular art. Do you think the practices that are represented by this material were equally spread across society, or were they located more at the elite level of society?
It's a very interesting question. Given the status attachment to this practice in the literary sources, it seems to me something that was only conducted, that could only be afforded at a higher level. But I suppose that it would be possible at other ranges too. But so far I've seen it, I've imagined it rather as an elite impulse. And it just has kind of echoes.
Mm-hmm. And is the art then a way of getting, shall we call it, lower status buy-in for elite practices, even if they don't participate in the practice?
It seems that is what I would argue, that it's aspirational, essentially.
Does then the material art go further than the literary art in terms of its accessibility across the spectrum, the social spectrum?
It would,
Maybe that's how
yes.
we should think of literature.
Yeah,
More
it
restricted.
is the full range of consumership within Roman society.
Mm.
Yeah, from the cheapest to indifferent workmanship to one-offs in silver
Mm.
and glass.
Because that would give even more reason why you focus, say, on the art, because it does something different potentially
Mhm.
to other materials or so-called, non-materials, as it were, that you may have.
Yeah. Oh, Krishna, did you?
Yes, I was wondering if we could entertain questions from the audience. And Solange has one. Solange Ashby?
Hi, Professor Bell. You and I happen to be collaborating on a publication right now. But
Nice,
I have, what's that?
nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm really glad to be able to attend your talk. So my question is more a comment on something you said about sort of the high status of owning an Ethiopian slave. And I just wanted to give some maybe historical and cultural context to that. And maybe insert the question, was this practice also true in the earlier Greek periods? But in the Roman period, very specifically in Nubia, and so Ethiopian is specifically to refer to Nubians in this period, right? At least in the Greek context. But during the Roman period, they're very much battling with the kingdom of Meroe, which was the contemporary kingdom in Nubia. And were having a hard time conquering that land, and in fact sort of gave it up and never did really conquer Meroe, and found themselves going into battle against these powerful Meroitic queens who were essential in repulsing Roman attempts to colonize that land. And I wonder if you think that the desirability of owning and sexually degrading young boys from this area was a way of trying to do in the home situation in a slavery context what they were unable to do in a military context while trying to dominate this powerful kingdom to the south of Egypt. And I guess also coming up against these incredibly powerful women who were going into battle with their troops. And so that sort of, for the Romans, that was anathema and horrifying. It might have been more appealing, more practical to abuse small male children from this land than to face these formidable Meroitic women.
Thank you. It's a really fascinating suggestion, in particular, in light of the fact that we don't have representations of Ethiopians as warriors. And so again, we have Numidian cavalry, for example, as compatriots, but that is not the same as representing the groups that you mentioned in that capacity. So it's a funny exception, but I think that makes a lot of in art. But I think that makes a lot of sense. So thank you. That's I think that's a fantastic idea.
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm struck by the phrase pet slave in Lanciani's description of the sculpture. And obviously he's addressing his clients or future clients, and maybe in Boston and in the New England area. So do you think, first of all, that phrase is curious to me. Wouldn't it have pointed to sexual servitude? And what do you think responses of the clients would have been to that phrase, including the MFA in Boston?
So he's translating a Latin word, and so that's sort of where it's coming from. But it seems kind of it seems very odd, given that you wouldn't think of the subject that's represented as fitting that particular term in a Roman context. At least I wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, in the fact that with that image, he picked out a representation in Rome of supposedly a portrait of a young Ethiopian girl. That's what he claims it represents. So it's just really, he's looking to be, crass about it. He's looking to make money. And so he's looking for these sort of singular works, and he must have assumed that these two types of representations would make him more money. I don't think there's a lot of worry on his part about offending anyone. It's just, I have these two exceptional pieces. Nobody else has these. And, that they're going. But I mean, the fact that he singles out that interpretation is very strange to me as well. So there was some kind of linkage in his head between, the perceived ethnicity of the subject and sexual servitude. It's very strange.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time. Professor Roth, would you have some final questions or comments?
I have one more question. It's more thinking aloud than a question, Sinclair. So in the 1st century AD, the agricultural writer Columella recommends not to appoint somebody to a managerial role who has experienced leisure and fancy stuff in town, i.e. enslaved person who has experienced these things in town previously, not one of the beautiful ones, etc. This has never been taken in the context of sexual exploitation, but if you see it in that context, and if you spin it a bit further, what is Columella worried about? And you could read into this a sensitivity that we claim did not exist in antiquity, namely that he's aware that people who are sexually abused over and over again, the beautiful boys, etc., they are having health issues, mental health issues, if not also physical health issues later on in life. This is where I think we can push the whole scholarship to start there, not to finally maybe end up there. We are very hesitant still as scholars to see what the ancient world was all about. It was pretty horrible from our perspective in any case. But there's no reason to think that people at the time, a lot of them didn't think it horrible too. And that the consequences that we can much more sophisticatedly analyze in people who suffer from abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, etc., that people in antiquity did not suffer from those consequences. We must assume they did. That surely must be our default. So it's not much of a question, it's more a comment.
Yeah, that's really powerful stuff. I think, I'm grateful to you for pushing the discussion in this way. I think Jerry Toner's book, wasn't it, on mental health or something to that effect, came out not too long ago. And so I think we're only beginning to think in that way. I certainly haven't yet, but I think that's a really productive line of inquiry. Yeah, of course, why not? Why wouldn't it be the case? And I guess that's to my final point is, I don't want to just repeat the art historical tendency to create a taxonomy and then move on to the next project. Here's an image, here's an image, here's an image, but also to think about, how can we use these images to understand humanity? The humanity of
it would be very good to have your work when you finish the project.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your conversation, and to Krishna.
Thank you very much for a very informative and provocative session. Thank you.
Thank you.